Picture Versailles at its birth, when the palace was not yet the sprawling monument of mirrors and fountains we know today, but already alive with ceremonial spectacle. In this setting, Louis XIV appeared less like a monarch and more like a vision made flesh. At 23 years old, he was hailed across Europe as the very embodiment of perfection. Courtiers whispered that his physique was carved by divine hands. Foreign envoys wrote with envy about his glowing skin and commanding stride, and poets compared him to the sun itself, radiant, untouchable, eternal. When Louis descended the marble staircase in 1661, clad in a ceremonial robe weighing over 30 pounds, and stitched with real gold thread, thousands held their breath. The young king's black hair gleamed, his posture upright, every motion deliberate yet natural. Venetian mirrors reflected him from every angle, multiplying his image, until it seemed the chamber contained not one monarch, but 100. His voice, deep, confident, resonant, carried across halls without effort, easily reaching those 150 feet away. Chroniclers claimed that his blue eyes flashed like stars and pierced straight through the soul of anyone who met them. To his subjects, this was no ordinary ruler. This was divinity walking in human form. But Louis was more than a handsome mask. He cultivated an arsenal of talents that magnified his aura. He spoke 5 languages fluently: French, Italian, Latin, Spanish, and German, each with ease that humbled visiting diplomats. At 20, he was already an accomplished fencer, so skilled that even his Italian tutors, widely regarded as the finest swordsman of Europe, could not match his speed. His stamina was legendary. He could hunt wild boar for hours through dense forests, then return to Versailles and dance until dawn without showing fatigue. Ballet was his particular stage of dominance. For 6 hours he could move without pause, executing steps with such precision that hardened nobles admitted they wept when watching his performances. Louis's mind was as sharp as his body was strong. His memory bordered on supernatural. He could recall the names, faces, and family details of over 3,000 nobles at court. This was no idle trick. By remembering who owed what to whom, Louis wove networks of loyalty that cemented his power. Every noble felt seen by him, and that sense of personal recognition bound them to his throne. Such memory was not simply convenience, it was weaponry. Appetite was another feature that set him apart. Records show he devoured 4 full meals and 3 snacks daily, yet somehow maintained a figure that radiated masculine vigor. Servants, however, noticed his hunger stretched beyond food. Palace whispers recorded that he entertained 12 or more lovers each month. Foreign ambassadors marveled at the almost magnetic charisma that seemed to draw men and women alike into his orbit. When Louis entered a room, conversation stopped. Hearts raced. Rivals softened. His presence itself was a performance, and Versailles was the stage. Every detail of court life reinforced this spectacle. Over 100 nobles fought for the honor of serving him each morning during the lever, the ritual of rising. Some would beg for the privilege of tying his shoes, others for the right to hand him a mirror. In the evening, during the coucher, men would compete for the small act of blowing out the king's bedside candle. These acts may appear trivial, but they were the mechanisms by which Louis transformed service into a form of worship. Versailles itself, designed with geometry and grandeur, functioned less as a home and more as a cosmic theatre. The palace's marble, imported from Italy, ensured that every footstep echoed with imperial authority. The hall of mirrors, lined with hundreds of reflections, magnified his godlike figure into infinity. 10,000 courtiers might gather each day, each choreographed motion reinforcing the illusion that the Sun King was more than human. Foreign dignitaries returned home with stories of wonder, fueling Louis's image across Europe as a man without flaw. And yet, beneath the silk gold and choreographed perfection, troubling shadows began to emerge. The same records that praised his dazzling physique also hinted at concealed weaknesses. Physicians noted he often required 2 or 3 enemas each day to relieve chronic constipation, the result of his compulsive overeating. Servants whispered of his foul breath hidden behind endless peppermint candies. His skin, though powdered smooth at court, was oily and scarred with acne. Beneath the layers of rouge and white powder, blemishes hid in silence. Most telling of all was his stubborn refusal to bathe. In 17th century France, many still clung to the medieval belief that water could weaken the body or invite malevolent spirits. Louis embraced this superstition wholeheartedly. He would wash his hands and face daily, but a full-body bath occurred perhaps twice in his lifetime. The young king, who believed his natural scent projected masculine authority, was quietly nurturing the seeds of his own downfall. It was a fatal irony. The same rituals designed to conceal imperfection also ensured it festered unchecked. When he was still in his radiant youth, few dared to confront him about these habits. Who would question a man whose very walk was said to make floors vibrate? Who would challenge a monarch worshipped as the earthly embodiment of the sun? Yet, hidden beneath the perfume and powder, his body was already rebelling. What began as vanity and indulgence would in time consume him. By the mid-1682, the first true sign of catastrophe appeared. At 47 years old, Louis summoned his physician to treat what he dismissed as a minor discomfort when sitting. It seemed unremarkable at first, a small swelling that caused pain. But this was no trivial matter. It was the first spark of an affliction that would unravel his divine image and transform the most powerful man in Europe into a prisoner of his own decaying body. Louis XIV had spent decades cultivating an image of divinity, but behind the golden facade his body had already begun to betray him. Even before his reign reached its height, those closest to him knew of the rituals required to maintain the illusion of vigor. The courtiers who whispered about his brilliance also whispered more quietly about his fragile digestion. By his mid-20s, Louis was already dependent on an unsettling routine, multiple enemas every single day. Court physicians administered them with elaborate ceremony, framing it not as a humiliation but as a divine cleansing, another ritual befitting a god-king. But the truth was plain: his appetite, vast and compulsive, had begun to overload his body. 6 to 8 meals in a day, heavy with rich game pastries, cheeses and wine, left him constantly constipated. For the common man, such excess might bring discomfort. For Louis, it created an unending cycle of painful dependency. The consequences were not hidden from those who lived within the palace walls. His breath was foul, so powerful it lingered in the air even after he left a chamber. He sucked peppermints to mask it, but the illusion rarely lasted long. His skin, so carefully powdered into a mask of marble smoothness, was oily and scarred beneath the thick rouge. The elaborate wigs that crowned his head concealed scalp irritations. Even his posture, once fluid and commanding, carried subtle hints of stiffness that close observers might notice but never dare remark upon. And still Versailles refused to acknowledge the cracks. Ritual disguised weakness. When Louis drank flavored waters and chewed herbs to soothe his stomach, courtiers were told it was a form of divine refinement. When he avoided washing his body, it was not presented as negligence but as wisdom. Bathing was still considered dangerous by many in 17th century France. Physicians warned that immersing the body in water opened the pores to miasmas, to unseen spirits, to corruption. Louis, deeply steeped in tradition, believed water might weaken him. So he washed his hands and face daily, but his body went unwashed for months, even years. What to us seems unimaginable was to him the very maintenance of health. This was no ordinary negligence, it was vanity cloaked in superstition. He believed his natural scent was proof of his masculine power, a fragrance no water should dilute. At court, this belief took on a ritualistic dimension. Attendants sprinkled perfume across the palace, changed flowers every few hours, burned incense in every room. The Sun King's odor, they insisted, was divine. Yet beneath the perfumes and powders, infection was quietly taking root. These private realities clashed violently with the public image of perfection. In 1670, Louis was still able to dazzle Europe. He danced, he hunted, he fenced, and he governed with relentless energy. Yet his physician's notes reveal a man already consumed by daily medical routines. Behind the glittering mirrors, he was a patient disguised as a king. Every day, foreign envoys came away astonished at his vitality, unaware that only hours earlier the same monarch had been subjected to painful interventions to keep his body moving. And so the contradictions multiplied. He was worshipped as eternal, but he was crumbling. He was seen as invincible, yet his body was fragile. It was as if two Louis coexisted in Versailles, the public deity and the private invalid. This fragile balance could not last forever. The breaking point arrived in January of 1686. Louis was 47 years old when he summoned his physician, Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, complaining of an unusual discomfort when sitting. The physician, known for his arrogance and failures, dismissed it as common hemorrhoids. A small matter or so, he claimed. But within days that discomfort grew sharper, transforming into stabbing pain whenever Louis moved. By January 22nd, swelling the size of a walnut had developed. By the end of the month, bleeding was constant. The king, who once commanded armies, who once danced for hours without pause, was reduced to sitting on cushions in his own court chambers to manage the agony. Then came the odor. By February 5th, servants reported a strange smell emanating from the royal garments. A week later, pus and fluid leaked through an opening that had formed near his rectum. Versailles, the grandest palace of Europe, found itself haunted by the stench of decay. Imagine a hall built to glorify perfection, suddenly filled with the unmistakable odor of disease. The contradiction could no longer be hidden. The Sun King, the radiant god of France, was rotting from within. Dr. Fagan's response was brutal in its futility. Enemas were increased, freezing cold repeated day after day, hundreds over the course of months. Bloodletting was introduced, half a litre drained each day to purify the royal essence. Strange concoctions were forced upon him. Bull's blood mixed with pearls, frog fat dissolved in brandy potions that belonged more to the world of alchemy than medicine. Each was administered with hope, yet each failed, leaving Louis weaker, paler, more desperate. In this period, Versailles itself seemed to shudder. Courtiers pretended nothing was wrong, but the reality seeped through the walls like the smell itself. Foreign ambassadors noticed shorter audiences. Servants whispered of blood-stained cushions, and of the king's mounting anger for pain had begun to erode his legendary composure. The divine aura that had sustained his rule was being eaten alive by infection. This was the moment when the illusion of the God-King began to falter. The sun, radiant and eternal, had entered eclipse. The affliction at first dismissed as minor had revealed itself as something far darker, a fistula, a festering wound that defied the medicine of the time. And with it began a nightmare that would last not for weeks, not for months, but for decades. The most powerful man in Europe, who once made hardwood floors tremble beneath his confident stride, now winced in agony with every step. The stench of Versailles was no longer the sweet perfume of roses and incense. It was the odor of pus, blood and rot. And yet this was only the beginning. For in the shadows of that suffering, another figure emerged, a surgeon preparing to do the unthinkable, to cut directly into the living flesh of the son, king in an attempt to save him, or to kill him in the attempt. By the spring of 1686, Louis XIV had reached a point of agony no ritual could disguise. The Sun King, once radiant with youth and vigor, was reduced to wincing at every movement, forced to sit on cushions while conducting affairs of state. The royal apartments designed for splendor now echoed with muffled groans. The infection near his rectum had advanced beyond denial. What began as hemorrhoids was in fact an anal fistula, a festering channel of rot that defied the medicine of its age. The greatest monarch of Europe was being consumed from within, and Versailles itself had become the theatre of his suffering. Dr. Fagan, his personal physician, pressed forward with a regimen that seemed drawn from medieval torture manuals. Enemas became ritual punishments, not one or two, but dozens administered weekly. Court records note that over 2,000 were forced into the king's body within 6 months, icy water pumped to cleanse the humours. But each one left him weaker, paler, more embittered. Bloodletting followed, a half-litre drained daily to purify what was deemed corrupted essence. Yet the more blood they drew, the more his strength withered. Charlatans swarmed Versailles with promises of miracle cures. Some offered potions brewed of bull's sperm mixed with wine, others a paste of crushed pearls dissolved in blood. Frog fat, exotic herbs concoctions steeped in brandy, each more absurd and desperate than the last. Louis swallowed them all, not out of trust but out of fear. For to admit failure was to admit mortality, and mortality was something a god-king could not acknowledge. But the stench grew stronger. Servants whispered of foul-smelling garments, of sheets stained with pus. Diplomats began inventing excuses to shorten their audiences. Even perfumed halls could not mask the truth. A radical solution was demanded, and into this nightmare stepped a man who would become infamous, Charles-François Félix, the royal surgeon. Félix understood the stakes with brutal clarity. Failure meant not only the king's death but his own. Success meant cutting into the most private and vulnerable part of the son. King's body without anesthesia, without precedent, without any certainty of survival. To prepare, Félix embarked on what can only be described as one of the darkest rehearsals in medical history. For months he performed experimental surgeries on living bodies, condemned prisoners, volunteers bribed with money, or pardons. The desperate poor offered a chance at royal favour. 75 operations in all, each a rehearsal in agony. Screams echoed in hidden chambers as Félix honed his craft, shaping a curved silver scalpel, designed for one task: to cut into the festering flesh of Louis XIV. On November 18, 1686, the moment arrived. Before dawn, the royal chambers filled with a secretive assembly of physicians, courtiers and assistants sworn to silence. The king lay waiting, no anesthesia to dull the ordeal. Only 4 trusted courtiers were there to hold him down. A block of wood was placed between his teeth so he might not shatter them during the agony to come. At 6 in the morning, Félix began. He pressed the scalpel into the flesh, and with the first incision came a burst of stench so foul that 2 assistants staggered from the room, vomiting into the halls of Versailles. Blood poured across silk sheets, staining them deep crimson. Louis bit down so hard he splintered the block in his mouth. The operation dragged on for 3 hours, each moment a torture beyond imagining. The scalpel carved deeper into infected tissue. Pus erupted thick and green-blue, over 200 milliliters of corruption pouring from the wound. The surgeon's notes, hidden for 3 centuries and uncovered only in 2007, described tissue so decayed that bone lay exposed beneath. Twice Louis screamed Mon Dieu with such force that the sound carried through the palace. Courtiers on lower floors froze, knowing their king was enduring something that could shatter any mortal man. By 9:15, Felix declared the operation complete. Yet what he uncovered was no victory. The damage was too deep, the infection too widespread. A single surgery could not cure the Sun King. Within weeks the wound reopened, and Felix was summoned again. December brought more butchery. The second operation left the king pale and trembling. The third pushed him to collapse. The fourth, a 6-hour ordeal on December 10th, was the most brutal of all. 6 men were required to pin him down as Felix carved further, cutting away infected flesh piece by piece. In total, 15 hours of conscious torture stretched across 3 weeks, each moment endured without anesthesia, each scream echoing in the perfumed halls of Versailles. When it was finally over, the surgeons announced success. The wound had begun to heal. Versailles celebrated. Prayers of thanksgiving were held across France. It was proclaimed a miracle, proof of the king's divine resilience. But this miracle came with a permanent cost. The operations left Louis with an incurable condition, a fistula that would never fully close. For the rest of his life, pus and filth would seep from his body, leaving him dependent on cloths, perfumes, and protocols to disguise the unending decay. The Sun King had survived, but survival itself was the cruelest fate. He was alive but transformed. A monarch, once defined by vitality and perfection, was now tethered to a wound that could never heal, chained to the stench of rot. The illusion of divinity could still be staged, but behind the curtains of Versailles, the truth was undeniable. The Sun King was a man rotting slowly from within. And yet France would not be allowed to see weakness. The stage would shift. The theatre of Versailles would adapt. From this point onward, the court of Louis XIV became less a celebration of perfection and more a vast machinery of deception designed to conceal a monarch's decay. Versailles had always been a theatre, but after the surgeries of 1686, it became something more sinister, a stage built to conceal decay. The monarch who once dazzled Europe with his perfect physique now carried a wound that never closed. Every day, pus and filth leaked from his body. Every day, the smell followed him like a shadow. And yet the rituals of absolute monarchy demanded that the Sun King remain divine. Versailles became less a palace than a perfumed prison, where courtiers conspired not to discover truth but to disguise it. Louis himself understood the stakes. His authority rested not on armies alone, but on the illusion that he embodied strength, health, and divine favor. To show weakness would invite doubt. To admit decay would unravel the very fiction of monarchy. His solution was as extravagant as it was futile, a revolution of perfume. Modern historians estimate he spent the equivalent of $2 million annually on fragrances. Bulgarian roses, Arabian ambergris, Indian sandalwood, Florentine iris. No scent was too rare, no import too costly. Versailles became an olfactory fortress saturated with oils, incense, and fresh blossoms. Servants worked around the clock to maintain the charade. Flowers were replaced every 2 hours. Special bronze braziers burned scented smoke continuously in every room he entered. Furniture was doused with perfume before he sat upon it. Even his meals were infused with aromatic oils, transforming food into medicine for the nose. Courtiers were instructed to carry ornate pomanders, spheres filled with herbs and spices, so they might withstand audiences with the king. Some foreign visitors pressed perfumed cloths to their faces. Still, none of it was enough. Beneath the sweetness of roses and the spice of cinnamon there lingered the inescapable odor of rot. The physical toll mounted as well. The trauma of repeated surgeries left him unable to exercise as he once had. His legendary hunts diminished. His dancing ceased. The body that once symbolized vitality began to balloon. From 165 pounds in 1670, his weight swelled past 260. By the turn of the century and by 1710 reached an astonishing 310. Thrones were rebuilt 3 times to hold him. Horses struggled beneath his frame, requiring multiple attendants to lift him into the saddle. The man who once moved with the grace of Apollo now shuffled with the lumbering gait of a man imprisoned by his own bulk. Then came the catastrophe of his mouth. In 1693, his physician, convinced that all illness stemmed from the teeth, ordered them all removed. Without anesthesia, crude instruments tore each one from his jaw. In the process, the surgeon shattered his upper palate, creating a hole that connected his mouth to his nasal cavity. From that moment forward, food and wine spurted through his nose whenever he tried to eat. His speech became slurred, his words dampened by constant drool. Courtiers leaned close to hear him, but doing so meant inhaling the foulness of his breath. Louis was becoming unrecognizable. The once perfect mask of youth had collapsed into a portrait of grotesquerie, an obese, drooling, toothless monarch who reeked of decay. And yet Versailles would not admit it. The machinery of ritual adjusted itself to maintain the lie. A new system emerged, color-coded ribbons placed discreetly to signal the king's state. Red ribbons meant the king was in pain, approach discouraged. White ribbons indicated his odor was tolerable, though masks might still be needed. Black ribbons marked the worst days, when the fistula's leakage was uncontrollable. Courtiers moved through this secret language of suffering, pretending all the while that divinity remained intact. The great rituals of monarchy, too, were reshaped. The lever, once a 2-hour spectacle of magnificence as nobles dressed the king, was shortened to half an hour to reduce exposure to his smell. The coucher, once a glittering performance of intimacy, became a means to secretly change soiled undergarments. Heavy curtains shielded the indignity from sight, while perfumes were sprayed to mask the act. Environmental tricks were added to the deception. Windows were opened in calculated patterns to create air currents that carried odor away from visiting dignitaries. Hundreds of bowls of flowers were refreshed every hour. Perfume machines belched clouds of scented smoke through the corridors. Entire architectural features of Versailles, once designed to glorify Louis, now served the more desperate function of concealing him. And still the truth pressed through. Visitors grew pale in his presence. Foreign ambassadors excused themselves, suddenly claiming sudden illness. Some vomited after audiences, blaming delicate constitutions rather than admit the obvious. The English ambassador requested meetings outdoors, citing fresh air for his health. The Spanish dispatched deputies in place of their principal envoy, unwilling to endure the stench. It was a grotesque irony. The monarch who once inspired swoons now inspired nausea. The Sun King, once dazzling in his natural scent, was now bathed in perfume clouds that could not hide the odor of rot. Versailles, once a palace of triumph, had become a palace of concealment. Every curtain, every flower, every ritual was dedicated not to celebrating perfection but to disguising decomposition. And yet, through all of this, Louis refused to surrender authority. The more his body failed him, the more fiercely he clung to the fiction of absolute monarchy. He ordered painters to depict him in youthful strength, even as his bulk strained his garments. He demanded that courtiers continue to treat him as untouchable, even when his undergarments had to be replaced secretly during audiences. He insisted he was still the sun, brilliant, eternal, even as darkness crept through his flesh. But if the surgeries of 1686 had broken his body, time itself was preparing a final humiliation. For in the last year of his reign, decay advanced in ways even perfume could not conceal. The Sun King, who once seemed eternal, was about to be consumed by death itself, slowly, visibly, horrifically. The year was 1715, and Versailles had grown accustomed to the smell of its monarch. Perfumes still burned, flowers still lined the halls, rituals still hid the truth, but the illusion was fraying. The Sun King, now 76 years old, awoke one August morning with a scream that shattered the stillness of dawn. His left leg felt as though it was being consumed by fire from within. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, the physician who had overseen years of suffering with arrogance and incompetence, examined the limb. His diagnosis was careless sciatica, a common nerve pain from sitting too long. But what Fagan dismissed so easily was something far more sinister. It was the beginning of senile gangrene, a condition that would devour the king alive. Within days, black spots appeared upon his toe. At first, small, then spreading until the skin itself seemed to burn and peel. By August 15th, the corruption was undeniable. By the 18th, the stench had changed. It was no longer the familiar odor of pus and filth from the fistula. It was worse, the smell of rotting human flesh. Even those who had grown accustomed to his presence faltered at this new horror. Servants fainted at his bedside. Courtiers whispered in terror. Diplomats began reporting home in gruesome detail. On August 25th, the blackness had reached his foot. By the 30th, it climbed his shin, leaving bone exposed as chunks of flesh fell away during bandaging. The palace was overwhelmed. The odor filled 3 floors, drifting even into the gardens. Foreign visitors could smell the king's decay from outside the palace walls. Versailles itself had become a charnel house, its halls echoing with both music and the unmistakable reek of death. Yet Louis still ruled. He signed decrees with trembling hands. He received ambassadors who forced smiles through perfumed cloths. He gave military orders, his slurred voice carrying the weight of command even as infection climbed his leg. Observers were stunned. One Venetian ambassador wrote, "The French king is dying by degrees before our eyes." The Austrian envoy described it as the most gruesome spectacle I have ever witnessed. The courtiers, for their part, maintained the ritual. They still bowed, still fought for the honor of holding his candle, even as they gagged behind perfumed masks. Nurses worked in shifts to change linens soaked in blackened fluid. 20 attendants rotated at his bedside, but many begged to be reassigned. Some could not bear the smell, which now spread so powerfully it reached into courtyards where children played. Foreign courts sent physicians not to heal but to witness. This was the most documented royal death in European history. Letters flew across the continent describing every detail: the blackened flesh, the falling toes, the cries at night, the unstoppable rot. The king who once embodied eternity was now a living cadaver, and the world watched. On September 1st, the inevitable end came. The king could barely speak, his throat itself affected by the advancing decay. Summoning his great-grandson, the boy destined to become Louis XV, the monarch whispered his last counsel. "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." His words, rasping and faint, carried the weight of decades of conquest, exhaustion, and regret. By that morning his leg resembled a battlefield wound, raw bone, blackened skin, weeping sores. His body trembled with the spread of infection. At 8:15 his heart ceased. The Sun King was extinguished, his light snuffed not by a sword or an assassin but by his own rotting flesh. But even in death the horror did not relent. His body, already bloated from illness, began to swell rapidly. Gases of decomposition built within, producing grotesque sounds from his coffin during the lying-in state. The odor, already unbearable, intensified until mourners covered their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar or perfume. The autopsy performed just hours after death revealed the full scope of the nightmare. His entire left side from foot to head was consumed by gangrene. His intestines were grotesquely swollen, containing a massive tapeworm that had lived inside him for years. His throat muscles were black with rot. The surgeons worked in haste, choking behind perfumed cloths, but the corpse decomposed so quickly that the embalming could barely be finished. The coffin had to be sealed with extra lead to prevent rupture. And still the official announcements told a different story. To the people of France, the king had passed peacefully after a brief illness. No mention was made of the weeks of screams, the smell of death that carried across the palace gardens, or the grotesque swelling of the corpse. The illusion of monarchy required that even in death the Sun King remain radiant. Reality was buried alongside him. But the courtiers who stood by his side knew. The foreign diplomats who wrote home knew. The physicians who fled the autopsy chamber knew. The Sun King had died as no king should, not in majesty but in horror. His end was not a peaceful fading of light but a slow descent into rot. The most glorious monarch of Europe, the man who built Versailles as a temple of magnificence, had become the most grotesque spectacle of his age. And yet history was not finished with him. For beyond the stench of his last days, the legacy of Louis XIV remained a paradox of magnificence, and mortality of divinity performed and decay endured. His final act was not a victory but a revelation that even the most absolute monarch is still in the end flesh and bone, fragile and mortal. When the final echoes of Louis XIV's death faded through Versailles, the palace that had once glittered with eternal light was left with a stench that no perfume could erase. For the courtiers who had watched his decline, the memory was not of a radiant Sun King who had dazzled Europe with his brilliance, but of a monarch rotting slowly before their eyes. His body had become a prison, his chamber a charnel house, and yet his authority had never wavered. This contradiction between the image of divinity and the reality of decay defined his legacy. In life, Louis had embodied the very essence of absolute monarchy. He centralized power, subdued nobles by making them dependent on his rituals, and transformed Versailles into the heart of France's political machinery. Foreigners marveled at his grandeur. Poets compared him to Apollo, the god of the sun, whose light nourished the world. For decades the illusion worked. He was admired, feared, envied, and imitated across Europe. His reign became the template for monarchical authority. But the illusion required constant reinforcement, and his body, as it failed, exposed the fragility of that performance. The perfumed halls, the endless rituals, the paintings that showed him ageless even in his final years, all were props in a vast theatre. Behind them stood a man whose flesh betrayed him at every turn. The anal fistula that never healed, the stench that clung to him, the toothless mouth that dribbled saliva, the bloated bulk that strained his thrones. These were not minor inconveniences. They were the silent counterpoint to his claim of divinity. For all his armies, wealth, and palaces, Louis could not command his own body. He could order generals into battle, but he could not halt the spread of gangrene up his leg. He could bankrupt his treasury on perfume, but he could not mask the odor of death. This was the final irony of absolute monarchy. The doctrine of divine right held that kings were chosen by God, elevated above ordinary men. But Louis's final decades revealed a harsher truth. No ritual, no crown, no perfume could disguise the fact that he was as mortal as his lowest subject. In the end, his courtiers vomited after leaving his chambers, just as peasants did when faced with rot. His great palaces became little more than elaborate deodorizing machines, and his life ended not with celestial glory but with screams, decay, and the swelling of a corpse that even lead could barely contain. And yet his story did not end with his death. Versailles still stands. The Hall of Mirrors still multiplies his reflection into infinity. Tourists still walk where he once walked, imagining him in golden robes bathed in sunlight. They seldom think of the rot hidden beneath those robes, of the filth seeping through silk, of the odor that perfumed gardens could not conceal. But perhaps they should. For that too is Versailles, both a monument to human ambition and a mausoleum of human frailty. Louis XIV's reign left France with grandeur and ruin. His wars drained the treasury, his palaces consumed fortunes, and his people bore the weight of taxes to fund his magnificence. Yet he also gave France a cultural legacy unmatched in its age: art, architecture, ballet theatre, diplomacy, and a vision of monarchy that shaped Europe for generations. His legacy was not one of simplicity. It was one of brilliance entwined with arrogance, beauty corroded by decay, glory undone by flesh. Perhaps that is why his story still fascinates. To remember Louis is to confront the paradox of power. He reminds us that no matter how high a man rises, no matter how divine he seems, his body will one day betray him. The Sun King, radiant and eternal in the eyes of his people, died as a rotting mass of flesh and bone, abandoned by the very body that had once dazzled the world. His own words to his heir, whispered through lips, cracked with decay, ring like a confession: "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." And so Louis XIV remains a warning, as much as a legend. A warning that absolute power may command nations but never mortality. A warning that divine right cannot defeat disease. A warning that even the brightest sun must one day set. Versailles is his triumph, but it is also his tomb. The golden palace that once magnified his image now whispers the truth of his end, that beneath every crown lies a skull, and behind every performance of divinity lies the silence of decay. The Sun King lives on in marble, in mirrors, in myth. But history remembers not just the radiance of his youth but the horror of his decline. He is both Apollo and Carrion, both god and corpse, both the most magnificent king in Europe and the most grotesque. His life is proof that power can build palaces, shape nations, and command men, but it cannot halt the simple, brutal truth of human mortality. And that is his true legacy. Louis XIV, the God King, who claimed to embody eternity, was in the end nothing more than a man, one whose body betrayed him, one whose death stripped away illusion, one whose memory still lingers, equal parts gold and rot.